Hey, this is Marvin and I wanted to talk a little bit about fluids and sounds today. We will open the menu and clicking on the two circles here on the top. And the first thing I wanted to mention is the Autopilot feature, which is a little bit more down the list here. And you can see that there are some fluids in the background, and that's because of the Autopilot feature, which is enabled by default. So when you disable that one, and then you can see that nothing has happened until I touch the screen with my fingers. But for now, we just wanted to enable the Autopilot feature. You can define how many fingers the Autopilot should simulate and also the speed of the Autopilot. Then, after mentioning that, I wanted to talk a little bit about the fluid section. Here we have a lot of parameters which influence the look and behavior of the fluids. You can define a complexity for your fluids. When you go for a low one, you can see that the complexity of the fluids become very simple. And when I go for a very high complexity, you can see that the fluids become more complex. The next feature is the resolution feature, which influences the amount of pixel which is rendered. So when you have a normal device, I would suggest to leave it in a medium resolution. When you have a high-end device, you can go for a higher resolution. And when you see that it does not have the performance you wish to see, you can also go for a lower resolution. Then there is a feature called invert direction, which basically changes the direction in which the fluids come out of your finger when you touch the screen. And there is a pretty cool feature which is called warp, and that changed the look of the fluids a little bit. So you can see it when you look at the edges of the fluids which will appear, and it looks a little bit different from the normal fluids. The next thing is the border, which you can configure. In the default setting, it's set to walls, which means that the edges of your device are the borders of the fluid simulation. And when I put some fluids to the border or to the edges of my device, you can see that the fluids will kind of bouncing back from the border. And I can also go for other settings, like simply defining no walls. And when I push some fluids now to the edges, you can see that they are just going through the device and disappear. And there is also a feature called connected, which basically connects the top with the bottom and the left with the right side of your device. So when I'm pushing some fluids to the top, they will reappear on the bottom and vice versa. There is also a feature called nuances, which will slightly change the look of the fluids in a certain kind of way. You will just see when you try it out. You can also define the size of the fluids, which sometimes makes sense. So you can go for a very large size and also make very small fluids. Here is the vorticity feature, which basically defines how chaotic the fluids look. When I go for a very high vorticity, you can see that there's a lot of chaos going on in the fluids. And when I decrease the vorticity, then you can see that the fluids are looking very smooth and without any curls or something like that. We have a parameter for speed, which can be used to make some kind of slow motion effect when I decrease that parameter. There is also a parameter for the intensity of the fluids and for the splat force, which means how much fluid should come out of my finger when I touch the screen. So when I go for a very low splat force, you can see that not too many fluids will come out of my finger. And when I go for a very high splat force, you can see that there is a lot of fluids coming out of my finger. And the last three things in that section are somehow related to each other, and it's basically how long the things in the fluid simulation should persist. So the first and the second are the force durability and the movement durability. And when that is set to a very high value, the forces inside of the fluid simulation will persist a long time. And when I decrease that value here, you can see that I have some kind of warping or bouncing back effect, which will make it look like we are underwater or something like that. And I will just go for a higher value here and show you what the durability does. So the durability is basically influencing how long the fluid itself should be shown on the simulation. When I go for a very low durability, the fluids will disappear very fast. And when I go for a very high durability, you can see that the fluids will stay on the screen a long time, and you have a lot of colors here because all that fluids I'm creating are staying there. The next section I wanted to talk about is the device section, where we have some features which are only available on iOS. There is the force touch feature, which influences how big the fluids will become with the amount of pressure you're giving into your touch when you touch the screen. So when I only touch it very slightly, the fluids are very small, and when I touch a little bit with more force, then the fluids become bigger. There's also a gyro sensor feature, which influences the direction of the fluids regarding of the position of your device. So when you're tilting your device, the fluids will go into another direction. And there's also the haptic feedback feature, which will create kind of a vibration when you touch the screen and create some fluids. The next thing is the color section, where you can define the colors which will be visible when you use the fluid simulation. And here we have the position-based gradient. It's basically a gradient which is on the complete screen, and depending on the position I'm here, the color is changing. So for that gradient, you can see that when I'm on the top right side, the color is kind of yellow, and when I go here on the bottom right side, then you can see that the color is green, and the color is depending on the position of the screen. You can define different kinds of gradients here, and there's also the random color feature, which creates a random color when you're touching the screen. We have a normal gradient, which is applied over time. So I will just go for another one here. I will go for the blue-purple one. And when I start touching the screen, the fluid is blue, and over time it changes to this purple color here, and then changes back to blue, and that's go back and forth the whole time. So the color is influenced by the gradient over time. And there are also this two color option, which defines that the first finger I'm touching the screen with is in the red color, and the second finger I'm touching the screen with is in the yellow color. And you can simply you can click on a color and define another color here, and that's it basically. We also have this RGB feature, which creates some really beautiful colors, and you can also define a velocity here. When I go for a higher one, the colors are changing in a faster way, and when I go for a very slow value, the color is changing very slow. Then we also have the random time color, which is also pretty cool, which gives some wonderful results. You can just play around with it and see what fits the best for you. The next section I want to talk about is a little bit special because it's a music section, and that's something very cool about fluids and sounds, because on the one hand you have the fluids which you can see in the background, and you also have sounds which will be created when you're touching the screen, and so we can simply enable the music. You can hear kind of a backing track or a little bit of relaxed music in the background, and when I'm touching the screen with my fingers, different sounds will appear. When I touch my screen with one finger, then the first instrument will appear. When I'm changing the first instrument here, you can hear that there is another sound when I'm touching the screen. And the same goes for the second instrument. The second instrument, which is basically triggered when you touch the screen with your second finger. And you can just play around with it a little bit and see what fits better to you. And when you don't like the first and the second instrument, but like the kind of wave sound which is in the background, then you can simply click on waves only, and that will disable the first and the second instrument, and you now just have this wave sounds when you click on the screen. And then there's a pretty cool feature which I also want to talk about, and it's a visualization feature. So when you enable that one here, okay, that's a little bit loud, you can load custom music into Fluids and Sounds and let it visualize the music. So here I have a preset selected, but you can also load custom files into it or let Fluids and Sounds listen to the microphone input. Here you can define mic sensitivity or audio sensitivity, which basically defines how sensitive the visualization is for the audio signal. When I go for a very high audio sensitivity, there will be more fluids because the fluids will react more to the audio signal, which is currently playing. And here I have different visualization modes. So I have the stairs currently enabled, which will give me some kind of a frequency spectrum which looks like stairs. Then we also have same kind of frequency spectrum in a horizontal line. We also have this radial feature here, which is basically having a small circle where the fluids will appear around. And we have the inner radial feature, and that's basically it. So you can play around with that and create some pretty cool music visualizations with Fluids and Sounds. The next thing I wanted to talk about is the Sunray section, which is kind of a screen effect which will be applied to the edges of the fluids to show you some kind of a sunray effect. There are a bunch of parameters you can just play around with to influence the look of the sun rays, and I can just disable them so you can see the difference. When I enable it again, you can see the sun rays which appearing, and that's basically it. I will just disable that for now so you can see the other effects a little bit more clear. The next thing is a global bloom feature. So when I disable that one, you can see that there is no bloom anymore in the background, and when I enable it again, you can see that there's kind of a shine or a bloom in the background, which looks pretty cool. You can change the intensity, and there's also a spotlight feature, which means that the bloom is basically there where you touch on the screen. And when I disable the spotlight feature, you can see that the bloom is on the whole screen. And I can also go for the bloom radial feature, which will also give some pretty cool effects sometimes. You can just play around with that and see for yourself which setting fits the best for you. I will disable the spotlight and the bloom radial for now and go to the next section, which are the particles which will be applied to the fluids. Here you only have two parameters, like the size of the particles you wanted to see and also the threshold, which means when I go for a higher threshold, less particles will appear, and when I go for a very low threshold, a lot of particles will appear inside of the fluids. Then we have a simple chromatic aberration feature, which will obviously add some chromatic aberrations to the fluids. I have added a simple pixelation feature, which will pixelate the whole simulation. There is a Scanline feature, which will add a pretty cool effect, which will make the whole thing look like on an old television screen or something like that, with some scan lines on it. And you can also choose a background. So for now we just had a black background, but I can also load a custom image into Fluids and Sounds, which will be added to the background. I can go for plain color, which I wanted to see in the background, or I can also have a clock That's a pretty cool feature. So basically you can have your phone near your bed when go sleeping, you see the time and can play around with the fluids a little bit. Yeah. And just go back to the black background. We already have talked about the Autopilot feature here. Then there's a pretty new feature which is called motion, which will add some kind of a motion blur effect, which will blur the motions which are inside the simulation, which can look very cool, I guess. And also a really new feature is the Kaleidoscope feature. When you increase the number of segments, you can see that you will create kind of a Mandela effect. So I can change the number of segments I wanted to have, and then I have kind of a mandala fluid simulation. That's it for the Kaleidoscope. And I also added a shake feature, which basically shakes the screen when you touch on the screen. That's also pretty cool. You just have to try it out on yourself. When touching the screen and enabling the shake feature, it feels like there is kind of a vibration or shaking going on when you move your finger. Now I want to talk about the preset section here, which is really cool when you just have discovered something you really like and wanted to save it and want to come back to it later. So let's say I define a pretty cool color scheme for my fluids. Let's choose a gradient and choose that one. And I just want to save that one because I think it's pretty cool and I wanted to come back to it later. So you just go to the preset section, enter a name for it. Let's say cool colors. And then I click on the check mark here and my preset is saved. So I have some default presets here you can go through, and I will just load the simplicity preset. You can see that the style of the fluids changed, and when I go all the way to the right side, you can see that my own preset I've recently created is just there, the cool colors. And when I click on load again, you can see that my fluid configuration is back. So the colors I've configured previously are back, and I can just come back to that preset whenever I want. The next thing I want to talk about is the random section, which is pretty cool because you can configure random looks and behaviors. The first thing you want to do is click on the configure buttons, on the configure button, and there are a lot of options appear. So basically you can define which sections should be randomized. Let's say I just want to randomize the color and the global fluid settings, but nothing else, and I can click apply. Then I have a loop time, which is basically saying how often the presets should be changed. So 10 means every 10 seconds. And when I enable the random button and also enable the loop, then every 10 seconds the things which I have configured previously will just change. So it's changing the color and also the behavior of the fluid a little bit. And you can also trigger the randomization without waiting 10 seconds. So you just can click on the random button here and the fluid simulation is changing accordingly. I will just stop that for now and remove the random button again. I will just go for another one. I don't like that. That looks pretty cool, so I'll stay for that right now. And here the last section is the other section, which basically contains a lot of other settings which I have not found another category for. So here you can add a screenshot and a recording button to the user interface, which enables you to record screenshots and videos. You can choose the record quality and the frames per second for the simulation. That's also pretty interesting because when you go down for the 30 frames per second, you can see that the whole simulation is getting a little bit more slow, and I would suggest to leave it at 60 frames per second, but you can just try to change it when it looks better for you at 30 frames per second. There's also some settings for the user interface, the UI vibration, which basically makes the phone vibrate every time you click on something in the user interface, and there's also a sound which will play when you click on user interface elements. You can change the recording format, which basically influences the aspect ratio of the video which will be recorded. You can keep the device aspect ratio, or you can also select 16:9, which will change the aspect ratio so it will be better compatible with a wider range of devices you will watch the video on. And here you also have some contact data, so when you just want to get in contact with me, just write me an email or join my Discord server. And that's basically it. Hope you have got some useful information from that tutorial, and wish you a lot of fun with fluids and sounds.